Ed's back ached as he set the shovel down next to him. He brought his watch close to the lantern and saw that it was nearly 5. Eyeing the foundation, he groaned, then wheeled the last wheelbarrow full of dirt outside, dumping it in his backyard near the fence. He had taken the day off, but taking a day off from managing your TV store to repair the foundation of your house was not really vacation day. Ed thought that he was getting old for this sort of stuff when he turned 30, but he knew, as sore as he was now, he wouldn't be able to move tomorrow. Still, he liked the idea of doing the work on his house himself, and the money they saved by not hiring a contractor, his wife could buy a vase or something. He trudged inside after dropping off the dirt in the backyard and glanced in the mirror. Yeesh. He'd been in the dark all day and was speckled with dirt. He scrubbed up a bit, threw on his blue sport coat, and found the keys to his car. He didn't bother telling his wife. He wouldn't be long. Just a quick check of the day's records, see how his employees were doing, let them have a quick dinner, and then head home. Ed arrived at his storefront and swore. No parking, and if he couldn't park there, neither could his customers. He groaned, his back already starting to flare up, and then made a U-turn toward the public lot. It was as he was turning his car around that something caught his eye. It was only a block away, and he only saw it for an instant, but an instant was enough. He slammed on the brakes and turned his head. There, in the middle of town, was a man hanging from a lamppost. His face was bluish gray, and he'd likely been there for hours. Ed stepped out of his car and started walking slowly toward the body, squinting his eyes against the setting sun. The body swayed gently in the wind, and Ed staggered backwards as he suddenly noticed something even stranger and possibly more horrifying than a dead man hanging downtown. The town was going about its day all around him, as though nothing in the world was different. No one seemed to care or even notice that a dead man was hanging in their midst. I'm Jason Weiser. From Bardic, this is Fictional. Don! Don! Ed Loyce said, and honked the horn of his car. He was on the other side of the street, back by his store, in full view of the body. Don, the owner of the store next to him, shot up a finger, telling Ed to wait. Ed could see he was with a customer. Ed shook his head and laid on the horn. Through the window, Ed could see Don point to him and apologize to the customer. The jingling bell on the door of Don's store was immediately drowned out by Don demanding that this better be good. He was with a customer. Ed didn't even wait for him to finish. He said that there was a man hanging from a lamppost. Where? Don asked. What? Right there, Don. You're basically looking right at it. Ed spat, his hand starting to shake. Oh, yeah. I mean, now that you mention it, there is a man hanging from that lamppost, Don replied with a shrug. How long has it been there? Ed demanded. And what is wrong with everyone? They just walk on past? Ed was nearly shrieking by now, and he didn't even notice the line of cars growing behind him. Don lit a cigarette, took a slow puff, and then shook his head. Take it easy, Ed. There must be a good reason, or it wouldn't be there. A reason? What reason could there possibly be? Ed could not believe he was having this conversation. Don took another drag of his cigarette. I don't know. You know, maybe it's like the time the Traffic Safety Council put that wrecked Buick downtown, torn about drunk driving. I mean, it's the 1950s, so good luck with that, but I'm sure there's probably a reasonable explanation. Rounding out the trifecta of super common American male names from the 1950s, the bell on the door of Jack's shoe shop jangled. Hey, you have a line behind you, Jack called out, lighting a cigarette of his own. There's a body hanging from a lamppost, Ed hollered back. I'm gonna call the cops. Jack shrugged. They probably already knew about it, or else it wouldn't be there. Don looked back at his store and saw the man at his counter getting antsy. All right, gents, gotta get back to work. He took a long, final draw on his cigarette before flicking it to the curb and heading back inside to see the customer. Ed, however, wouldn't let it go. Oh my gosh, you see it, right? You see it hanging there? A man's body, a dead man? Yeah, so, Jack replied. I saw it this afternoon when I went out for coffee. You mean it's been there all afternoon? Yep, Jack said, cocking his head and taking a final drag on his own cigarette. I don't get it, Ed. I don't see what the big deal is. Anyway, I gotta get back to work too. I'll see you later. Jack joined the stream of people walking along the sidewalk at the end of the workday. Everyone going about their business. Some looking up at the dark mass swaying gently in the wind, but no one stopping. No one as concerned as Ed, who stared in disbelief. The long honk startled him from his thoughts. He'd completely backed up Main Street. Ed glanced in his rearview mirror and slammed on the gas. He shook his head and muttered to himself. He felt like he was going crazy. There was a dead man hanging in the park downtown, and no one seemed to care. But he noticed. He cared. Ed spun the wheel around and jumped the curb, parking haphazardly, the rear of his car jutting out into traffic. He got out and slammed the door. In moments, he was below the body, the rope creaking a bit with every sway. He took one look at the man and thought he was going to be sick. Ed didn't recognize him. This was a 1950s American small town. Ed knew everyone, and yet he didn't know this man. The man's jacket was almost as shredded as parts of his skin. His eyes bulged, and his tongue was thick, blue, and swollen, and no one cared. Ed stepped back without thinking and bumped into someone. Jenkins, the clerk at the stationery store, shot a nasty glare at him before smiling. It was Ed, but what was wrong? Ed ended up having basically the same conversation with Jenkins that he had with both Don and Jack, but after seeing the body, grew more and more distressed. Soon, Margaret from the jewelry store walked up to see what was going on. Then the flow of traffic on the sidewalk began to stop by Ed, to see what this man was freaking out about. No one else really having an issue with a torn-up body dangling from a lamppost. Ed watched the townspeople gather to witness his public breakdown and screamed at them. Do something! Don't just stand there. Do something! Can't you see something's wrong? Something's happened? The crowd looked at the poor man. What was wrong with him? Was he drunk? He was probably drunk. The crowd melted to allow two heavy-set police officers in the circle to see Ed. Ed smiled with panicked relief as he saw the men. He took his handkerchief out of his jacket pocket and mopped up his brow. The officers grabbed him and hurried him into their police car. Name, the cop with the notebook muttered. Loyce, Edward C. Loyce. Listen to me. Back there in the park, there's... Address, the cop demanded, cutting him off. Ed gave the policeman his address. That here in town? Yeah, Ed said. Look, none of this is relevant. Back there in the park, there's a man hanging... Where were you today? The other policeman behind the wheel asked. Where was I? Ed stammered. You weren't at your shop. Where were you? The policeman asked. No, he shook his head. No, I was at home. Down in the basement. In the basement? Yeah, digging. A new foundation. Gaining out the dirt to pour in a cement frame. Why? What does that have to do with... Was anyone else down there with you? The policeman asked. Ed explained that he was alone. His wife was downtown and his kids were at school. Then, a look of relief washed over him. That's what it was. He had missed it, hadn't he? The explanation for why it was there. The police looked at each other, and then the one driving looked in the rearview mirror, back at Ed. Yeah, he had missed it. Ed slid back in his seat. Then it was supposed to be there. Good. The men nodded. Yeah, it was supposed to be there. For everyone to see. It's all on the level. Ed flopped back in his seat and let out a long sigh. Oh my gosh. Man, I thought it was like the KKK or fascists or communists or someone had taken over or something. But if there's a reason for it that I just missed, then I feel better, Ed said. I guess I got pretty excited back there, but now I understand. There's no reason to take me in, right? I have to get back to my store to man the counter. My employees need to eat dinner. The two police officers said nothing. Ed shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Look, I'm all right now. I won't cause any more trouble. Is there any need to... This won't take long. It's a short process. Only a few minutes. The police officer with the notebook said to Ed, without looking back. Well, I hope it's short, said Ed, shifting again in his seat, as the car began to slow to a stop for the light near the courthouse. It was dark now, and the streetlights had just come on. I guess I did disturb the peace, he said. I got all excited But Ed did not finish that sentence. He yanked the door open and dove out into the street just as the police car was speeding up. He looked up and saw that there was a horn blaring and a bumper inches from his face. He leapt to the curb and pushed his way into the crowd. He didn't look back. But just behind him, he heard the slamming of doors, more horns, and shouting. Ever since the police officers had taken him into the car, Ed had been inching toward the door. When he had come to his senses, he had realized it. They weren't police officers at all. He knew every cop in Pikeville. You couldn't run a store in town for 25 years without knowing everyone. And he had never seen these two men in his life. Furthermore, there hadn't been any explanation. Don, Jack, Margaret, they didn't know why the body was there, and they didn't care. That was the strange part. Ed burst into the hardware store off Main Street, and the clerk greeted him. Before watching in confusion, as Ed shoved his customers and messed up his displays in an attempt to get to the back of the store as quickly as possible, Ed threw open the back door and stumbled out into the back parking lot. One sprawl over a garbage can and a climb over a fence, and Ed stopped. Panting, he listened. He didn't hear anyone behind him. Good. He had gotten away. Ed ducked into the alley. It was dark there, and he looked out on the town. From that spot, he could see City Hall, and that's when Ed froze. At first, he thought it was just a trick of his eyes. The sky above City Hall seemed darker than the normal night sky. He paused and focused, and yeah, it was darker than the night sky. Something was there. In the dark, there appeared to be these things coming from that dark shape too. It was hard to make them out. Their darkness blended with the darkness of the sky, but they almost looked like giant insects descending down into the town. The hiss of the hydraulics brought him back, and his eyes shot to a bus that had pulled to a stop. He looked back to City Hall, but saw only the normal night sky. No blackness. Nothing descending. He looked back to the bus, to the sign on the front, and shot his hand into his pocket. Feeling enough change to get home, he held up his hand and ran for it. Panting again, he made it and took a seat. What was going on? It had been less than a half an hour since he saw the hanging stranger, and in that time, he watched his friends and fellow business owners revile him as crazy or drunk or both. He'd been arrested and then escaped police custody, and now he'd seen... What had he seen above City Hall? Ed brought his thoughts back to the hanging stranger, the one no one seemed to have a problem with. Even for something as ridiculous as that, it was still difficult to oppose the whole world when they were clearly on a different page. Ed ran his fingers through his hair and slumped down on his seat. What if he was wrong? What if he was losing his mind? The bus rocked as it picked up speed. They had left the main area of town, and there weren't any more stops before the residential districts. At the very least, Ed was heading home. He sighed and looked out the window, and then he noticed something else. In the reflection, the man on the other side of the bus was watching him. When Ed's eyes met his own in the darkened window, the man calmly went back to his paper. Ed turned around to look directly at the man, but his eyes were fixed on the paper. They weren't moving along the text, just staring, waiting for Ed to look away. Then Ed looked around the bus. It was like a wave. As he looked around in panic, the other passengers, one by one, they went back to their papers, or books, or looked out the window, or simply looked at the floor. Ed didn't know it, but as his gaze passed over them, each face calmly looked back to Ed. Ed tried to suppress a tremor. It wasn't just the man whose reflection he had caught in the window. They were all watching him. Ed stood, straightened his blue sport coat, and then made his way to the front of the bus, dozens of eyes following his every step. Ed pulled the string, to signal the driver to stop the bus, but the driver ignored it. He pulled again, and a few of the strangers in the back of the bus also stood. As Ed inched closer to the door, row by row the bus stood. Ed shook his head, looked to the lever that controlled the door, and pulled it. We'll catch up with Ed Lois as his world continues to fall apart around him, but that will be right after this. Audiobooks are great for helping you become a better you, whether you want to feel healthier, get motivated, or learn something new. And with an unmatched selection of audiobooks, original audio shows, news, comedy, and more, Audible has all the audio content you need to start your year on the right foot. You can try books like The Hanging Stranger, the one we're listening to today. It's a collection of short stories by Philip K. Dick. And there's other stories from Season 1, including The Call of Cthulhu, Macbeth, and The Time Machine. With Audible, you can get through tons of books while doing almost anything and switch seamlessly between devices, from your phone, car, tablet, or Amazon Echo, and you can pick up exactly where you left off. Start a 30-day trial and your first audiobook is free. Go to audible.com/fictional, or you can now text fictional to 500-500. That's audible.com/fictional or text fictional to 500-500 for a 30-day trial and free first audiobook. You can do it with audiobooks. We're dog people, and while both our dogs are adorable, I've learned that a bored dog is a misbehaving dog. So really, BarkBox saved our couch. It's a themed monthly delivery of toys and treats to match your dog's unique needs, including allergies and heavy chewing. Plus, it ships free within the continental US. I knew the puppy would love it. The surprise was older Abby diving headfirst into the box. She never plays like that anymore. Yet she's trotting around the house with a squeaky dumpling from this plush takeout container, fetching a Lady Liberty ball, and rolling around with a deer chew. Apparently, BarkBox knows my dog better than I do. I posted pictures on social media for proof. If you're looking for more ways to treat your pup, try BarkBox. If for some reason they don't like something in the box, BarkBox will send you something they will love, free, because they are all about dog happiness. Visit barkbox.com/fictional for a free extra month, a whole extra month of BarkBox when you subscribe for a 6 or 12-month plan. That's barkbox.com/fictional for a free extra month when you subscribe to a 6 or 12-month plan. All right, now back to the show. Blood dribbled down his forehead. The last thing you remember was the bus driver yelling at him and slamming on the brakes, and the bus riders rising up and coming for him. Then did he throw himself out of a moving bus? He looked at his scraped up hands and arms, his torn blue sport coat. He felt the gash on his head. Yep, he had thrown himself out of a moving bus. That's when he heard the footsteps. He must have been out for only a few moments, because the bus had just finished screeching to a stop. The riders that had stood while he clambered to the door were now pouring off of it. They were coming for him. His head pounding, it groped in the darkness for a rock. In the night, all the passengers were dark, hazy, insect-like shapes, like the ones he had seen above City Hall, and they were all coming for him. When the bright-eyed man, the first one Ed had seen watching him on the bus, grabbed his ankle, Ed found his rock. He kicked the unsuspecting man's legs out from under him and brought the rock down hard on his head. The man gasped and then pleaded with Ed. "Stop! For God's sake, listen, But Ed didn't. He brought the rock down again and heard a sickening crunching sound. Ed found his feet and ran. No one followed. The passengers gathered around the man who had been reading the paper and watched his assailant fade into the night. As he rounded the corner to a street, Ed began to wonder. Was he wrong? He was going based on what? A stranger he had seen hanging downtown and a dark shape he had maybe seen above City Hall? Ed shook the thought away. No, he had seen what he had seen. The town was losing its mind, being taken over by something. He had to get to his family and get out of Pikeville. Ed's wife, Janet, backed away from her husband. He was bleeding in torn clothes, holding a butcher's knife, and ranting about aliens from another dimension who could control people's minds and take over their bodies. He claimed to have escaped from police that weren't really the police, and he knew they would come here, so they'd be looking for him. They all had to leave, right now. Janet shook her head, but Ed said that he wasn't asking. He grabbed her arm and led her to her coat. They would take Old Ranch Road to Oak Grove, the next town over. Ed said that the aliens weren't infallible. They weren't omniscient. They made mistakes. He was one of their mistakes. And why wasn't Janet calling the twins down from their rooms? Janet shook and called Tommy and Jimmy from their rooms. Tommy skipped down the stairs, but his smile faded when he saw the state his dad was in. He said he had been doing his homework. But Ed barked that there wouldn't be any more homework. Your teacher's an alien, and we're leaving town forever. Tommy was confused. Okay, he said before looking to his mom, who quietly shook her head. Where's Jimmy? Ed demanded, the knife outstretched. Jimmy was 7, a skinny little guy with brown hair and a wide smile. At least that's how Ed would remember him. The thing that descended the stairs was somewhere between human and insect. Something between his son and whatever he had seen hovering above City Hall. It wore Jimmy's shirt and pants, though torn now. It still had Jimmy's voice, too. And one of his eyes looked on his father with the terror of a boy who was losing himself, and the rage of the alien that threw itself down the stairs, stinger out at Ed. Janet and Tommy stopped feigning fear and stoically stepped aside to let one of their own kill Ed. When it hit him, Ed dropped the knife. The thing slashed and bit at him, cutting gashes in his arms and face. Though the insect was strong, it was still small, like his son had been small. Ed began to overwhelm the thing, and it talked back, in the voice of his son, pleading with his father, telling him to stop. His father was hurting him. Ed had to close his mind off as he finally pinned the creature to the ground and picked up the butcher's knife. When it was done, the fluids of the thing that had once been his son mixed with his own blood to stain what had once been his son's shirt. Janet and Tommy's eyes went from Jimmy to Ed, and they took one step forward. Ed shook his head. They still looked like his wife and son, completely. There was no way he could do that. He pulled the butcher's knife free and ran out the door. "10 miles. 10 miles to Oak Grove. He didn't end up taking Old Ranch Road in the car. He had to crawl on his hands and knees for fear of being seen by them. And for most of the way, he could hear them above him, buzzing and searching. He had started through the fields on the edge of town around 8 p.m., and he continued on until he saw the sun rising over Oak Grove. Around 4 a.m., he knew he had gotten past them, but still, he kept crawling, soaking in the sunlight after a long, long night. He stumbled into a gas station and found the attendant. The man didn't look at him with focused rage, like they had, but with concern. Ed asked if he could use the man's phone. The Oak Grove police commissioner turned the tape recorder off. "I believe you," he said, and offered Ed a cigarette. "Oh, thank God," Ed breathed and relaxed. The police said it was a 1 in a million chance that Ed escaped, that he wasn't at work when they took over the town. Ed shook his head. It was 2 in a million. The man he had killed, after he jumped off the bus, he had bright, intelligent eyes, not like the ones of his wife and son after they had been turned. He had pleaded with Ed. Ed killed another human. 2 freak accidents then, but the rest of the town, it's under their control, the police commissioner said. Ed held up a finger. There was one thing he didn't understand. The hanging stranger. Why leave a body hanging in the park in the center of town if you were trying to quietly infiltrate? The commissioner took a drag of his cigarette. Really? Ed somehow put it together that they were aliens from another dimension, but he didn't get why they put a hanging stranger in the middle of town. It was bait. Ed sat up straight. Bait? The commissioner shrugged as he finished up his cigarette and started another. Yeah, bait. The hanging stranger was there so that Ed would reveal himself, so they would know who was under control and who had escaped. Ed recoiled. Escaped? Then they expected failures. They were ready with a trap. The commissioner stood. Like Ed said, they weren't infallible. They couldn't know who was turned and who wasn't. The other guy on the bus had been hiding in plain sight after all. Ed had reacted. He had made himself known. He fell right into their trap. Now then, the commissioner continued, we have a lot of work to do. He knew Ed was tired, but there was no time to waste. Ed stood and followed the commissioner as the man opened the door to the interrogation room. Ed stopped him. Since the commissioner seemed to have some insight into all of this, then who was the hanging stranger? Ed had never seen him before. He had been beaten up. His clothes were shredded, shoes caked with mud, deep gashes on his arms and face. The police commissioner smiled. Ed would understand in time. As the sun set, the vice president of the Oak Grove Merchants Bank, Clarence Mason, came up out of the vault, threw the switch for the time locks, and put on his hat and coat. He hurried outside. It felt good to be up and moving around. He had been examining the safety deposit boxes to see if they could add another tier. Spoiler alert, they couldn't, and it had taken all day to figure that out. He said goodnight to the bank guard, who locked the door behind him, and Clarence walked out to the city street, where people were going about their evening. He turned the corner, thinking about his wife, kids, and a hot meal on the table, when something caught his eye. It was a telephone pole in front of the police station, and it was dangling not 20 feet in front of him. He staggered back a bit when he made out the shape. It was a man. He looked from side to side and dared to get closer. Soon, he was standing not 5 feet away from the man. The man had been beaten with deep gashes on his arms and face. His shoes were caked with mud, and his blue sport coat was shredded. The look of him made Clarence sick. But the strangest thing, the thing that really confused the man, was that the citizens of Oak Grove just walked on past the stranger, hanging on the telephone pole. Nobody else seemed to notice. That's the story of The Hanging Stranger by Philip K. Dick, the same guy who wrote the super popular Wub story from season 1. And now it's time for the best of the worst. And yes, we're still doing the best of the worst. Thanks to everyone who wrote in and tweeted feedback on that. There were votes for and against it, but overwhelmingly in favor of keeping it around. The villain this time is He/She, from some 1940s comic publisher called Boy Comics. He/She is exactly what they sound like. They're half man, half woman. It's an uninteresting sort of deal. We have no backstory, no explanation, and He/She is split right down the middle of their body, with the right half looking like a 1940s sort of male mobster, and the other half looking like a 1940s female movie star. One arm and leg is burly and muscular, while the other half is graceful and lithe. He/She, which the narrator explicitly states has no soul in the very first panel, deceives a woman into marrying them. A week into the marriage, the wife was thinking something might be up when she had already loaned her husband $35,000, which in today's dollars, adjusted for inflation, is around $500,000. And the person she married never took their coat or gloves off, and always had a hat pulled down to one side. During a pretty intense fight, the wife pulled the hat from the body and discovered long, flowing dark hair and a beautiful half of a female face, and immediately deduced that the person she was married to might have been lying to her the whole time. Unfortunately, He/She was as evil as they were offensive and poorly thought out, so they picked up the wife over their head, and because this was published by Boy Comics and was intended for children, He/She murdered their wife by throwing her on the ground and jumping on her body, causing her back to audibly snap. And then they took a pickaxe to her house cat before hiding both the bodies in the basement. The hero that she went up against was named Crime Buster. And if that sounds like something a 15-year-old would come up with, well, that's because Crime Buster was a 15-year-old kid with no superpowers other than military boarding school training. Chuck Chandler, aka Crime Buster, took to the street in a hockey uniform and cape. To his credit, he avenged his parents when they were kidnapped and killed by a Nazi named Ironjaw, an evil-er Nazi with, yes, an iron jaw. Oh, and Crime Buster also has a monkey sidekick named Squeaks, because sure, Crime Buster's crime busting is police sanctioned because he's hanging out with the commissioner when the commissioner gets a call from a woman downtown who said it sounded like her landlord was getting murdered by her husband, mainly because she heard a half-brusque, half-sultry voice saying, "I'm gonna murder you," before hearing a back crack. Crime Buster and the police show up, and while the police buy she's story, Crime Buster takes a trip down to the basement, where he hears a cat meowing in pain from inside the walls. Apparently the cat lived. Squeaks the monkey saved Crime Buster from a pickaxe of his own to the head when she discovered Crime Buster discovering the wife's body, and then the chase began. During the chase, the same thing happens over and over again, where several men are alerted and entranced by half of she's body and jump in to rescue her from Crime Buster. Crime Buster loses track of she twice, but manages to steal the ill-gotten nest egg. Because it was the 1940s and apparently you could do this sort of thing, the police commissioner and Crime Buster put an ad in the paper that a wealthy old man needs, quote, a girl companion, thinking that there was no way she would be able to resist. She was not able to resist. They showed up to the sting and they got arrested. Comics in the 1940s did not mess around with having villains come back over and over again. The last time we, or anyone, sees she, the villain is being dragged toward the electric chair, pleading for their life, while Crime Buster and his adult male friend, the police commissioner, sit around his office, chatting about how nice it is that she is dead. I guess if there's anything to take away from this villain, it's that if you're about to get married, and someone is only showing you half of their face, never takes their trench coat off, and has borrowed upwards of 20 grand from you, I'm not saying get a prenup, but, get a prenup. That's it for this time. Today's episode was written by me, Jason Weiser, and edited and produced by Carissa Weiser. Our theme song is by the amazing Breakmaster Cylinder. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.